We will begin this week with a very brief overview of assessment in early childhood, followed by a discussion of legislation related to assessment for both Part B and Part C, and we'll wrap up with a look at recommended practices for assessment in early childhood. Assessment is an integral part of educational planning for young children with disabilities. The assessment process provides us with information related to each child that allows us to individualize learning. The continuous assessment system provides an overview of the assessment process for young children in Kentucky. First, screening information is used to provide a quick overview of a child's development. A screening is just a quick look at a child's development and should never be used to determine the need for eligibility. Typical screening instruments used in early childhood programs include the Denver 2 and the Dial 4. Also, the Brigance Kindergarten Screen is currently used to screen all children prior to beginning kindergarten. Screening instruments can help us determine whether or not to pursue additional information about a child, but as mentioned before, they are never used to determine eligibility for special education services. After screening is completed, the information should be used either to direct a teacher's planning for the child's ongoing instructional needs or to move the child into the response for intervention process. Response to intervention allows us to gather additional information about a child in order to decide whether or not a diagnostic assessment is needed. Diagnostic assessment is used to determine eligibility for special education services. We determine eligibility with diagnostic instruments. A diagnostic instrument provides standardized scores that are used to compare a child to a group of peers or the normal child. Diagnostic instruments are thus referred to as norm-referenced instruments. The Battelle Developmental Inventory 2 is one diagnostic instrument widely used to determine eligibility for early childhood special education services in Kentucky. Eligibility for special education services under the developmental delay classification is 2 standard deviations below the mean in one developmental area, or 1.5 standard deviations below the mean in 2 developmental areas. The developmental areas are cognitive, communication, motor, social emotional, and self-help or adaptive. Preschools use these 5 areas. However, First Steps has gone to a 7-domain eligibility: cognitive, receptive communication, expressive communication, fine motor, gross motor, social emotional, and self-help or adaptive. If a child is determined eligible for special education services, an individualized plan is developed and the child begins to receive services. The collection of assessment information is not only used to determine eligibility, but also to create an intervention plan for the child. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, provides federal administrative guidelines for eligibility determination for special education services. Part B of IDEA governs children ages 3 to 21, while Part C of IDEA governs children ages birth to 3. Each state must also develop regulatory requirements under the law. So in Kentucky, we have the Kentucky Administrative Regulations for Special Education Programs, which governs programs for children ages 3 to 21, and we have Kentucky First Step Regulations, which govern programs for children ages birth to 3. The Kentucky Administrative Regulations include guidance related to response to intervention and ongoing systematic assessment to determine each child's response to the intervention provided. Response to intervention has been put in place to eliminate the overrepresentation of children in special education services based on lack of previous educational experiences or cultural or linguistic differences. Response to intervention must be implemented before a child can be referred for diagnostic testing to determine eligibility for special education services. The regulations also provide detailed guidance related to evaluation methods and procedures that are used in determining a child's eligibility for services and in developing the individualized plan. Assessment procedures must be non-discriminatory and provided in the child's home language when possible. A variety of methods must also be used, including norm reference, standardized procedures, observations, and interviews with the child's family and other individuals knowledgeable about the child's performance. Assessment tools must be technically adequate, we'll talk more about this in a later module, and must address all areas of concern related to the child's abilities. The Kentucky First Steps Part C administrative regulations are similar to those under Part B. One difference under Part C is that a child may be referred for eligibility evaluation based on a parent's request. As required under Part B, First Steps requires multiple methods of evaluation and multiple sources of evaluation. Non-discriminatory assessment methods that are culturally and linguistically appropriate must be used, and the assessment information must be used to develop an individualized plan if the child is determined eligible. Parent permission and involvement is required as it is under Part B. First Steps regulations specifically mention the use of clinical judgment in making eligibility decisions. We'll talk more about clinical judgment in a later module. The Division for Early Childhood of the Council for Exceptional Children is a professional membership organization with which you should be familiar. DEC focuses on issues related to young children with disabilities and other special needs. The organization promotes policies and advances evidence-based practices. The DEC recommended practices have been developed to provide guidance on the implementation of evidence-based practices for young children ages birth to 8 with disabilities and their families. The practices address 7 topic areas: assessment, environment, family, instruction, interaction, teaming and collaboration, and transition. For the purposes of this class, we'll focus on the assessment practices. There are 11 recommended practices related to assessment of young children. These include practices related to the appropriate materials and strategies, family involvement in the assessment process, non-discriminatory assessment practices, and the use of clinical judgment. As early childhood leaders, it is important to understand best practices related to assessment of young children. It's also necessary to know and follow administrative regulations associated with assessment. This week, you'll be reading the administrative regulations and making your own determination related to the appropriateness of the regulations as compared to recommended practices.